All right, everyone. Welcome to another episode of BFA Conversations. How's it going, Luke?
It's going great. How are you?
I am fantastic. I just got a good little leg day in. So
Nice. I
starting off
just put
good.
baby to bed. Put baby
Nice.
Blackman to bed.
Got
Yep.
much better scenery than I do.
Yeah, not too bad. Not too bad.
Good. We got to fix that camera one day so yours is actually like landscape. I don't know how to do that on Zoom. What happens if you turn it to the side right now? There you go. Fixed.
Okay.
All right, guys. So today we've got an interesting topic. I'm actually going to let Luke kind of lead the charge here because he's so heavily involved in the MMA and striking community. Luke, so there's been a lot of kind of crossings of sports lately, boxing to MMA,
Yeah.
MMA to boxing, particularly with those two. And maybe we'll go into the future about potential crossing over to jiu-jitsu from MMA and vice versa.
Yeah.
But what is it, do you think? And of course, you have Askren, who gets knocked out by Jake Paul, and then he's Jake Paul talking trash to Kamaru Usman and all these other people. So the question is this: why do you think so many MMA fighters are struggling in the sport of boxing? Why do you think a bunch of boxers struggle to make the transition to MMA? And then kind of the last portion of the question I'll get into afterwards, which I know we discussed briefly, but I guess start there.
Well, I don't know that there's a big sample size of MMA to boxing. There are a couple though. Certainly
James Toney.
Oh, I'm saying like MMA fighters.
MMA to boxing.
Over to boxing. Yeah. Certainly Askren, is the standout example right now because that was a recent fight. There's an MMA fighter who, I mean, he's not like ranked pound for pound. Oh, I wish I could remember his name. He had some fights in the UFC. He did all right, and then the promotion ended up releasing him. Thank you. Well, he took transition to boxing like very seriously, and he did like 8 fights and ended up upsetting some people who were like considered up and coming fighters that they thought might be contenders and stuff, and he was winning fights that he wasn't supposed to. It was interesting what he was doing though, because he wasn't fighting like a boxer. He was fighting very much like an MMA fighter, so it was a lot like lots of punches and awkward combinations, and you could see like some of those fights he won were just like the boxers weren't used to people fighting that way. It was just, it was a weird pace, and he just got ahead on cards and surprised some people. So there's not a huge sample size. Now, there are some MMA fighters who back in the day boxed with mixed results, when they were real young. But yeah, you don't see too many, but there's a lot of people who have tried. I know obviously Connor's the other big one.
Yeah.
Obviously, what Connor had working against him is the fact that, he was going against Floyd, who's amazing. He's one of the greatest boxers of all time, probably at least the best of his generation for sure. And, as much as Connor's a phenomenal striker, that's just not the same thing. It's not the same thing as going in. And that's, what we saw in that fight. So, your
thoughts on Silva? I know Silva had 4 or 5, maybe 6. I'm not sure how many fights.
He had a couple.
If I'm not mistaken, he did well in a bunch of them, but not against. I mean, he never went against anyone who was. I mean, he is now, but he never went against anyone who was a huge name. Yeah,
he went against some other low level guys to mixed results. I think he won a couple, lost one. So yeah, it was mixed. But it's also important to remember that he never.
You're really like covering your camera.
Oh, sorry. He boxed to mixed results, but it's also important to keep in mind that he didn't really hit his stride until much later. I mean, because people forget that there are essentially 2 careers of Anderson Silva. There's his early MMA career where he was always like close but no cigar. Like he was clearly special. He had some amazing wins. In Pride, he very famously flying knee knocked out Carlos Newton. There's a couple his cage rage days and stuff like that, but people forget that he essentially ended up, he wasn't making the big money. He wasn't getting those huge fights though. And he essentially was broke until Rodrigo Nogueira said, like, I think you're special. Like, I think you've got what it takes to be a legend. And essentially bankrolled his fight camps, like said, no, come and train with us. I'm vouching for you. I'm giving you the shot. So that's worth mentioning. Some of it is that in MMA, it's other than doing jiu-jitsu competition, it's not super common to cross over. And that's the same in boxing. In boxing, there are boxers who crossed over and did kickboxing, but that's not the norm, you know, whereas like, there are sports where it's more fluid. You're expected to. Kickboxers, you know, it's kind of expected. Like you might do some boxing bouts. You're probably going to do a couple Muay Thai bouts. Muay Thai guys from Muay Thai it happens now where they'll do kickboxing. You'll see in ONE FC, you'll see guys do both kickboxing and Muay Thai, but it used to be the norm where in the 80s and the early 90s, those Muay Thai legends would also pretty regularly go and box. I mean, there was guys who are mostly known. Well, okay, we brought up Floyd Mayweather, a really interesting guy over in Thailand is oh man, what was his name? I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but well, I'll put it in the comments. But anyway, he was an amateur boxer from Thailand, and he won, I believe he won the gold medal the year that Floyd was in Atlanta. Like he didn't go against Floyd, but he beat the guy who beat him. Huh. And then he went over and was like, well, I won in the Olympics. I'm done boxing, and was like, okay, I guess I'll go do Muay Thai because that's the national sport. Yeah. So he went over, and the guy was an absolute freak in Muay Thai. Like he could tell he just had fun, and he really should have been a title holder, but you know, you could tell that they weren't giving him the top fights and stuff like that, and like they weren't giving him title shots. But it's worth noting that he embarrassed Boonlai, who no one embarrasses him. He's an absolute freak. He's a legend, and this guy just made him look silly. I mean, it's so they used to be more normal for those crossovers.
So why do you think there's this huge push right now from MMA to boxing? And even if it's like people are just calling people out now to get fights.
Yeah, I think, I think it's the obvious. There's a couple people where I think it's challenged. I think with Anderson Silva, first of all, this is not the first time he's been talking about it. Just to cover the base of what we're talking about, Anderson Silva is going to be doing a boxing match against Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., who I think is an interesting, good match. I think that that's different than a lot of the matches we're seeing, where it's like against YouTubers or against other non-boxers, people of different other sports and stuff, and we're just beating in boxing. That's actually Anderson Silva jumping in. And while Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. is not a pound for pound great, he's not the greatest in his division. He's also not a complete chump. Like he's won matches. He has a name, he has exposure and stuff. He is a legitimate boxer. He's been boxing since he was a kid. So that's actually a really tough match for Anderson, but it's also not Anderson jumping up against somebody where he has the excuse of like, oh, well, how was I supposed to be? I mean, it's not him fighting, it's not him fighting Terrence Crawford right now. Yeah. It's not him fighting like, oh, I'll just eat, a bunch of donuts and I'll fight Deontay Wilder. Like, it's nothing like that. Like, this is someone where it's like, it's almost scary because the expectations are you've got a shot, but you are also the underdog here. You just need to do this right and take this very seriously if you want to win this. So that's the most interesting of these matches. But I think the other one is, what's the obvious motivator for everything, right? Yeah. Money. So look, people get real sensitive about this, but the UFC kind of notoriously doesn't pay its athletes. I mean, they signed a contract. They are fighting for what they signed for, but out of all of those combat sports, it's crazy. The share value for MMA fighters is very, very low. And we can say, well, they signed that contract, but it's like, that's fine. But we also can't blame them when they are biting on the proposition to go fight, one of the Paul brothers, or
make like
KSI
40 million or something crazy.
Yeah, and make exactly $30 million. Well, it's like how many times would Kamaru Usman have to fight to make that? Yeah. And here's the thing: is he's for that one. I mean, a maximum of 8 to 10 rounds, and he would make more than he would make in like 5 fights in the UFC. There's no question. It's a no-brainer as to why it happens. It makes sense. It's a shame that he would make more for a freak show than he would for legitimacy. Legitimate. But this is. I think I mentioned when we did our Q&A that the only bit that upsets me is that the freak shows make so much more than, again, both Jake Paul and Ben Askren made more for fighting each other than Pagreus made fighting on the same card. So, that's the only bit that upsets me a little bit. If they wanted to be,
I actually think that Pagreus. So I did look that up. I'm not positive, but I think his purse was bigger
than Jake Paul's.
I believe it was, if I'm not mistaken. Let me look that up.
Yeah. Check that out. I want to say I looked it up too, and I didn't. I definitely.
You might be right. I'm by no means an expert on the Jake Paul fight card. So let's see. I've got it right here.
That may be.
Okay. The full-on purse. So here, let me ask you this question while I'm pulling this up.
Yeah.
What do you think it takes in order to make that crossover successful? And then the next question is, who in both sports do you think could make a successful crossover?
What do I think it takes? Well, first of all, taking it seriously.
Pagreus made to confirm. Askren, this is just the basic purse. Now, pay-per-views, I'm sure they had different distributions. Basic purse.
Yeah.
At least what I'm seeing, Askren 500,000, Jake Paul 690, Ivan Redcat 250, and Pagreus was 850. So the base purse he was high. Now I'm sure the pay-per-views were split to where it was definitely not in the favor.
Okay, well, look, good. I'm glad to see that. So as far as like what it takes is like to take it seriously. Like you actually need to go work at a boxing gym or with boxers. Like you can't just, I'll just do a lot of boxing sparring. It's not the same.
Yeah.
You can't just have somebody who just holds pads for Muay Thai fighters hold pads for you. It's not the same. You have to respect that it's a sport. There's a reason that boxers hold the Diaz brothers in high regard. And the reason is because they show up to boxing gyms with boxing shoes. They lace up their boxing shoes and they put in work with boxers. And they've been doing this for years. So it's like they came in with a decent amount of respect. There's a lot of boxers who've come forward and said like, yeah, the Diaz's could for sure box professionally. Would they be world champions? Probably not. I mean, maybe a minor title, but probably not world champions, but like they're decent. They actually have respect from the boxing community. You will even hear like casual boxing fans mention like the Diaz brothers when they're talking about like people who could cross over. So I think go ahead.
Because say, what about vice versa, going from boxing to MMA?
There's not many people I think could, but someone who understands clinching is huge. So the person I have always thought could have made that transition. There's no monetary reason for them to have, but could have made that transition is Andre Ward. I always thought he could have, because his understanding of being able to hit people, and he'd use very like Muay Thai like frames. He'd put his forearms against people's neck. He'd lower himself than the other person. He would use leverage in order to get there. He'd sidestep so that guys couldn't come in. And he was really good at avoiding other people grabbing him too. Like he was one of the few boxers who, when other guys would try and stifle and grab him, he would dig for underhooks. So I absolutely think that he could have transitioned and like really done something. It's worth noting that a high level boxer that isn't getting talked about enough, that is talking about within the next year transitioning into MMA, is Clarissa Shields. And she had worked before with Andre Ward. So I think that there's a lot of potential for her as well. There's footage of her out working with Jackson Winklejohn, working with John Jones and stuff like that. I think she absolutely could do it. Holly Holm, very famously, was a boxer for a long time. That was her career. And she transitioned into MMA. So it can be done, but you really have to get serious. You can't have a foot in both, in both.
Adesanya was a kickboxer and then came over.
Yep. But he did it right, because I think by the time he had over 10 fights by the time he was in the UFC. I think he had like 17 fights or something. So it's like he didn't just be like, in my third fight, I'm going to be in the
everyone
UFC.
assumes, for some reason, for the longest time, I thought he was, and he is still, he's still going to be in his prime for a while, but I thought like, oh, he's younger, he's got a small record.
Yeah.
That man's got a lot of fights under his belt.
Yeah.
Between kickboxing and MMA, he has fought a lot.
Exactly. Well, it's a lot like when you see these like older dudes from Thailand, like Sanchai will still fight guys and who are in their 20s, and everybody's like, oh, well, he's older. or something like that. And it's like, yeah, but he's got a lot of experience. I use the example a lot of Remen Deckers has a loss on his record to Sakmankal, who was 17 when he beat him. That's not a knock on Remen Deckers though, because I think Sakmankal had like 140 fights by the time they fought. He was 17, but like, the dude went pro at like 8. So, they've seen a lot. So look, if you're going to transition over, I recommend taking it slow. Your coach needs to be choosing matchups that are slowly going to make you see different things. This time you're fighting a strong striker that you can probably outwork, but it's in small gloves. Next match, maybe you fight somebody who doesn't have a lot of knockout power, but he's got decent, but he's going to make you go the whole distance. Essentially, he's very hard to finish, and he's kind of decent everywhere. Okay, next you fight a wrestler. He doesn't have a lot of power in his hands, but he's hard to stop the takedown. So you can work that in. You need to be seeing different things in each fight. It can't just be I'll take all comers and try and get to the top. I think that's a tough way to do it. You need people to bring you up the right way and have respect for the sport you're jumping into. Very notoriously, James Toney came over to do MMA, and it was very obvious he had not done any MMA. Like, it was like he fully was like, I am 100% willing to either land. If I land my one punch, I'm knocking Randy Couture out. If he takes me down, I'm just done. And it was like he knew. You could just see he had not done any training MMA at all. So it is what it is. Okay. But it can be done. It just takes doing it the right way and respecting what you're doing.
So here's my last and final question, then we'll close it up.
Yeah.
If you were to put any UFC fighter into a boxing ring with a top 10 or top 5 guy in their division for boxing, they have a year to train, and you have to put your money on the UFC fighter, who would you be willing to bet on? Based on their work ethic, based on...
I assume this is people without like a pure boxing background. Like this can't be like Holly Holm, say.
Yeah, no.
Let me think.
You'd have to put your money on them, and you'd be confident they could show up.
I think
Adesanya.
I think Adesanya is one.
I thought you would have gone with the
other one
Diaz.
would be Nunes. The other one would probably be Amanda Nunes.
She's just a freak of nature, and she works hard.
Hits like a Mack truck. She's also got good instincts as far as
great endurance.
Like the way she kept her cool when in the very first exchange of her fight with Cyborg. I think Cyborg kind of clipped her, and Nunes kept her feet under her, backed up, got her space, and then fired back and knocked Cyborg out. I mean, like, that's high level stuff. That's what you need to do, is keep your chin down. You can't start bad habits when you're getting clipped. And Nunes has got great composure as far as all that's concerned. The names that are coming to mind are actually, oddly enough, I didn't think this, but they're mostly female fighters, because I think Rose Namajunas could as well. She's got a great 1-2. She got a decent chin. She's got a good stance. I think she could, but certainly I think Amanda Nunes and
never thought about Nunes. That's a good one.
Yeah,
I thought you would have gone with one of the Diaz brothers.
At this point, in their prime, absolutely, I would have. 100% I would have in their prime. But at this point, it's the same reason that I always tell people to pump their brakes on O'Malley, is like, I can't sign off or put money on somebody that I see fight once every year and a half. I don't know where they're at. I know that both Nate Diaz is out of the Leon Edwards fight with an injury, but Nick Diaz is supposed to fight too. But it's like, I don't know is this Nick Diaz in his prime? Is this the Nick Diaz that ruled Strikeforce that's coming back? Or is Nick Diaz who, could be a lot slower, could be could be more chinny. His reflexes might be shot. I don't know. I would love to see Nick Diaz at his best come back and fight some people in the welterweight division now. I think that'd be interesting. I think that'd be fun. But when you don't see somebody often, how could you bet on that? But yeah, certainly Nunes and Adesanya, I'd put big money on. Probably Rose too. Oddly enough, not many of the guys are coming to mind where I'd bank on them in boxing. Oh, Peter Yan. Oh, for sure.
Peter Yan, yeah.
Peter Yan's got hellish boxing. He's got a very like European amateur boxing style. I think he actually, maybe not win a world title, but like, for sure he could be a pro. I mean, like he could absolutely be a pro and a contender. Like that guy's, the way he uses a high guard in MMA is ridiculous. So Yep.
Sweet. Well, awesome. That's all I've got. Anything you want to add? I mean, you've been talking
Stay tuned. We got other
98% of the
series.
time.
We heard the call for the pad holding series. I've had people talk to me personally about that, wanting to see that. So we're gonna get that going. There's a couple other things we've got coming down the pipe. We've got something coming up where a situation of ours is changing. We're going to be saying goodbye to something, so stay tuned for that. Make sure that you are liking and subscribing. Hey, our subscriber number has jumped up on YouTube lately, so thank you for that. Please keep liking and subscribing, and if any of you are not bashful, look, it really does help if you leave a comment. We will respond. We will get back to you. Do it. Exactly. All right. Appreciate it, guys.
Thank you, guys.
All right. See ya.